Well, thank you very much for those very kind remarks. And don't worry about the Berkeley-Stanford mix-up. I love them both. And I love Harvard as well. And I love George Washington University and the University of Ottawa for that matter. Oh, can't forget MIT, where I did my first 2 degrees. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Alan Bromley and his predecessors and his intellectual heirs. I'm going to talk about the scope and the roles and the challenges in the science and technology policy process generically, and then I'm going to turn to the title of these remarks, the official title, and talk about the challenges and opportunities in the Obama administration, what we're doing about them, what we propose to continue to do about them, and what the particular challenges are that we face going ahead. Bill has already said a lot about Alan Bromley, so I don't have to say so much. He was a remarkable individual. All of the things listed here and more. I had the pleasure of knowing him, although not as well, I'm sure, as Bill Bonvillian did, but certainly I learned from him. And among the things I learned from him was quite a lot about how to be an effective science advisor to the President of the United States. He was a superb mentor in all of the fields in which he excelled himself, and his mentees are all around the country and all around the world serving in important roles in science and technology and in public policy. He was a role model for all of us. I had the great good fortune to learn from a number of other giants in the study and practice of science and technology policy. None of us ever figured out how to make a microphone stand up. Those included George Kistiakowsky, who was the second science advisor to President Eisenhower. He was the first presidential science advisor that I met. I met him in 1973 at a Pugwash conference. And that was probably the moment in my life when I started aspiring to be the science advisor to the President of the United States. I admit that somewhat sheepishly, but my early acquaintance with George Kistiakowsky, who was a professor of chemistry at Harvard, a fantastic individual and another extremely effective science advisor, made me start thinking that if I was extremely lucky and in the right place at the right time and did everything else right, I might possibly someday aspire to be a science advisor to a president. Harrison Brown, another one of my early mentors, remarkable character, Foreign Secretary of the National Academy of Sciences already in his 30s. He was really the guiding genius behind the founding of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, a pioneering international interdisciplinary center of research and analysis on major problems of the human condition. Harvey Brooks, certainly one of the fathers of science and technology policy as a discipline, the founder of the program on science, technology, and public policy at Harvard that I had the great honor of leading following Harvey once removed with Louis Branscombe in between. Joe Rotblatt, one of the founding fathers of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, a tremendous figure in science and public policy globally, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995, which he shared with the Pugwash Conferences. Jerry Wiesner was President Kennedy's science advisor and then President Johnson's, and was a dear and close friend of mine and another mentor from whom I learned an enormous amount about many things, including, again, about how to be a science advisor to the President of the United States. There are other giants in this field that are fortunately still with us that I learned a lot from. Dick Garwin, who was a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee to at least 3 presidents and remains today in his 80s a consultant to OSTP of enormous value to us. Frank Press, science advisor to President Carter. Jack Gibbons and Neil Lane, the 2 science advisors to President Clinton. Jack Gibbons in the first term, Neil Lane in the second. Both very close friends of mine, with whom I worked as a member of PCAST in the Clinton administration. And again, I learned a great deal from working with them and watching them operate in this environment. Paul Doty, an amazing individual, the founder of the Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and also one of the founding fathers of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, who helped get me into that international science and technology policy milieu at a relatively early age. I want to talk about that domain a little bit, and the domain has really two dimensions, two sides to a coin, as Harvey Brooks always described it. One is science and technology for policy, meaning, as indicated here, the analysis and advice for policymakers and for the public, that we are able to produce about the science and technology dimensions of all of the policy issues with which our political leaders and our publics are or ought to be concerned. And the other side of the coin is policy for science and technology. And that relates, as indicated here, to the analysis and the advice and the recommendations we provide on R&D budgets and related policies, on science and technology education, science and technology workforce issues, infrastructure, scientific integrity issues, and policies. And there's a ... there to indicate that there are other dimensions, some of which I'll talk about. And of course, a cross-cutting focus that cuts across those two dimensions, science and technology for policy and policy for science and technology, is the study of the mechanisms and the processes by which all of this gets done and how to improve the effectiveness of those mechanisms and processes. And I know a lot of people in the program here at GWU, a lot of the people in this room, are preoccupied with exactly that. How does this really work, and how do we make it work better? There are a variety of roles for both natural and social scientists in the science, technology, and policy domain. I've listed some of them here. Research and analysis on both of those dimensions, including the assessment and improvement of the processes by which those things happen. Communication of the findings to colleagues, to policymakers, to the public, through all these different vehicles, reports, articles, books, op-eds, blogs, interviews, lectures, briefings. Communication is enormously important in the business of science and technology policy. Indeed, it's absolutely essential. And typically the people who are the most successful in this domain are not only the people who have devoted a lot of time and effort to understanding what they need to know about the substance, but people who have learned how to communicate that substance to policymakers and to the public. Of course, teaching and training of students and colleagues to enable or to improve their performance in those kinds of roles. And that's, again, one of the things that's going on in the program here and its counterpart program in Ottawa. And science and technology education activities aimed at improving the general science and technology literacy of decision makers and the public as a basis for more informed engagement with this set of issues. Some people, of course, do all of these things. Some focus on a subset. All of those different distributions of effort are important and respectable, and I'm sure the students in this room will find themselves distributed across various combinations of these kinds of activities. I want to talk about some generic challenges of process as it relates to the policy environment. One has to do, as I've already implied, with educating and energizing the public. We've got to figure out how to do more to overcome the generally low level of understanding in the public of science and technology. And in doing that, we need to figure out how to make the relevant insights accessible to a wide audience without oversimplifying. This is really one of the great challenges in science and technology policy communication. How can you keep it simple enough to be understood by a very wide audience and at the same time not make it wrong? Enormous challenge there. And another great challenge is, very frankly, how do we rebut nonsense in a soundbite culture? There's a lot of nonsense out there. And what I often say is somebody can tell a lie in one sentence that takes 3 paragraphs to rebut. And in the soundbite culture, you might not get the 3 paragraphs. So how do you deal with that? How do we get better at rebutting the nonsense that's out there in this very demanding situation that so much has to be conveyed in soundbites? Another big challenge, of course, a set of challenges, are the challenges of teaching and training in science and technology policy in colleges and universities. There's relatively few colleges and universities have gotten really good at this. This is one of them, I'm happy to say. But doing that requires, first of all, overcoming a deeply ingrained academic prejudice against interdisciplinary pursuits. There remains a conviction out there among some people that interdisciplinary pursuits are the last refuge of people who couldn't hack it in a discipline. This is not correct. Interdisciplinary work is at least as challenging as disciplinary work, requires in some sense a different set of skills, a different set of capabilities, a different kind of training, but it is no less rigorous, no less demanding, no less challenging than disciplinary work. A second big challenge, of course, is maintaining funding for science, technology, and policy efforts in academia under the kinds of budget constraints that everybody is facing. There is, again, a tendency to sort of fall back on the traditional disciplinary department and say, well, we're going to do that. If something has to go, it's going to be the interdisciplinary efforts. We have to resist and fight that. But something that is not a problem, I have found in my experience, and I ran an interdisciplinary graduate program at Berkeley for 23 years before going to Harvard for 13, never had a problem finding appropriate posts for our science, technology, and policy trained students and postdocs. There was and remains enormous demand for the people who can actually do this, who can integrate the natural science and social science dimensions of these issues and make it intelligible and make it applicable, implementable. Talk about a few challenges of process in the policy environment in terms of doing what I and my colleagues at OSTP are doing today, what I call internal advising for national governments. That is, as opposed to trying to get your views in front of the government from outside, how does it work when you're on the inside? What are the challenges in working in science and technology for policy and policy for science and technology inside the government? One of the huge challenges there is allocating budget resources among competing needs. There is no formula for doing this, no cookbook that tells you how to deal with this particular challenge. The budget is never enough. The competing needs are always compelling. Enormous challenge in our day-to-day work is dealing with that. And Kei Koizumi, sitting there in the second row, who I know teaches here as well as working as my assistant director for federal research and development at OSTP, is struggling with this every day and helping me struggle with it every day. How do we do this allocation job? Another big challenge is how you reconcile, or if you can't reconcile, at least tolerate, the diverse agency perspectives on questions like transparency and openness, on questions like the proper role of scientists, including government scientists, in public communication, and so on. Different agencies have different roles, they have different views, they have different cultures, and somehow we have to make them all appear to be perhaps more seamless than they are in their approaches to these matters. Another big challenge that preoccupies a lot of our time is fomenting and coordinating interagency initiatives. The Office of Science and Technology Policy has the responsibility for everything interagency relating to science and technology. Any science and technology initiative, venture, activity that requires the participation of more than one cabinet department, agency, office is under our oversight. And that's a huge challenge. It's often like herding cats to get folks to work together in an effective and mutually supportive way. On the science and technology for policy side, the other side of that coin, one challenge is coming to grips with the reality that the facts from the science and technology side are never everything in the policy process. I used to tell my students at the Kennedy School, which of course is a policy school, and I'm trying to teach them science and technology for policy. First thing I would say to them is the science and technology facts are not everything, but they are usually something. It helps if you begin from a place when you're thinking about policy in a particular domain of understanding the basics of the relevant science and technology. If you try to form policy without that, you're almost certainly not going to get it right. Although, again, the science and technology are never going to be the whole story. They're going to be economic issues, political issues, values issues. That's why we have politics, in fact, is to deal with competing values and the tensions and the trade-offs between different dimensions of these complicated issues we face. Second big challenge, day to day, is cultivating cooperative relations with the other advisors. I'm the science and technology advisor. I got to work with the economic advisor. I got to work with the national security advisor. I got to work with the domestic policy advisor. And in fact, it was Alan Bromley, perhaps more than anybody else, who told me how important it was to cultivate those relationships with your colleagues who are advising the president with stature equal to yours. They're all assistants to the president for something. Assistant to the president for domestic policy, assistant to the president for national security, assistant to the president for homeland security. You've got to develop good working relationships with those folks or you're sunk. You're going to spend all your time fighting with them for turf and access if you don't have good relations with them. And finally, absolutely crucial, is using the time and attention of the principal wisely. My principal is the President of the United States. And if I don't use his time wisely, if I impose on his time for matters that could and should be resolved at a lower level, I'm soon going to lose the degree of access and trust that I have. This is absolutely crucial. Whoever your principal is, whether you're working for a president, a secretary, an undersecretary, an assistant secretary, an agency head, use the time and attention of that person carefully. Do what you can to get things done without rushing every time there's an issue to the principal. Let me turn now to the science and technology linked challenges and opportunities specific to this administration. Some of them, of course, many of them were shared with prior administrations, but these are some of the ones with which we're preoccupied now. The President, looking at this in an overarching way, first of all, when he spoke to the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences in April of 2009, becoming, by the way, the first president since JFK to go over to the National Academy following his inauguration and talk to the annual meeting. And I found that particularly wonderful because JFK had gone to the National Academy accompanied by my mentor, Jerry Wiesner, and I got to go to the National Academy with President Obama, where he gave this remarkable speech about his views about science and technology in the context of the crises and challenges of our time. And he said this much quoted statement that science is more essential for our prosperity, our security, our health, our environment, and our quality of life than it's ever been before. Talk about two sets of challenges linked to science, technology, and innovation, both domestic and global. The domestic ones, and you could all make your own list, probably would have some similarity to this one, but you might have some other items. Economic recovery and growth obviously has to be very high on the list. Science and technology and innovation are enormously important there as drivers of recovery and growth. Some of the kinds of tech that are going to be germane are infotech, biotech, nanotech, green tech, other techs probably not yet discovered or even thought of. Healthcare. The aim there is better outcomes for everybody at lower cost. That's a huge challenge. Science and technology have an enormous role to play there. The energy and climate challenge, which I see and the President sees as tightly intertwined. We need cleaner and safer energy supply, including not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but reducing oil imports, environmental impacts of a variety of other kinds along the way. There's a whole set of other resource and environmental issues that are increasingly coming to the fore. Water, which many people call the next energy in terms of the set of problems that water availability and quality are going to cause for the world. Land use, coastal zones, toxic substances, biodiversity, and sustainability. How do we manage all of those things? National and homeland security, another domain rich with challenges and opportunities for science, technology, and innovation. I've mentioned some here. How to better detect and disarm improvised explosive devices. Cyber and power grid security, biodefense, how we ensure the safety and reliability of a shrinking U.S. nuclear stockpile without nuclear testing. And in the global domain, again, health, preventable and pandemic disease, enormous set of challenges there. Development, how do we eradicate poverty and provide the possibility of sustainable prosperity for everybody. Energy and climate, this is not just a problem for the United States, not just a problem for China. The challenge is to provide for societies everywhere the energy their economies need without wrecking the climate that their environments need. Land and water, we are witnessing an intensifying competition for the world's land and fresh water, competition among the principal human uses for those crucial resources, among the production of food, fiber, fuel, the provision of land and water for infrastructure and industry, and of course for ecosystem function. We have to leave something left over of our land and water for the ecosystems on which we still depend for the cycling of most of our nutrients, for the production and maintenance of the fertility of the soil, for the natural cleansing of the atmosphere and surface waters, for the maintenance of habitat for biodiversity, which is really a library of genetic information from which new drugs, new foods, new vaccines will come. The oceans, their ecological integrity and productivity, absolutely essential to the future prosperity of human society. And finally, weapons of mass destruction. Again, how do we ensure that we can avoid the use of nuclear and biological weapons anywhere in the world? I want to say a few words about how President Obama views this rather daunting set of challenges. The first thing he thinks about them is that they are interdisciplinary and they are interconnected. And in fact, there's probably no better example than that than the intertwined challenges of energy, economy, environment, and security, which are intimately entwined in a great many different ways, and of course, extremely interdisciplinary. You have to understand engineering, economics, physics, chemistry, biology, climatology, and politics to even begin to comprehend the nature of that problem or to sort it out. The second major insight in President Obama's views about these challenges is that science and technology are not just relevant to success, they're central to success. We're not going to get there without a greater set of contributions from science and technology. And that centrality means putting science and technology in the center of what the federal government thinks and says and does about these challenges. It means, as the President said in his inaugural address, putting science in its rightful place. And in fact, we talked about this in my job interview. I went to Chicago in December of 2008 to meet with the President at his request to talk about this job. And he talked about this in that interview, about science in its rightful place. I mean, one of the interesting things is these insights that I'm going through are not things that I had to explain to President Obama. President Obama started with this set of insights about what we were dealing with. Don't worry about him in the sense that he doesn't have a science education, doesn't have a science background, but what this president understands about science and technology and how and why they matter is simply extraordinary, simply extraordinary. Fourth insight is that success in these challenges requires not only applying science and technology to the specific challenges as we perceive them, but it also requires nurturing the cross-cutting foundations of strength in science and technology, and I'll say more in a minute about what those are. And finally, that interdisciplinary and interconnected character means that solutions require partnerships across federal agencies, across the branches and levels of government. There's the legislative branch, the executive branch, federal, state, local. Requires partnerships among public, private, and philanthropic sectors, and it requires partnerships among nations. Interesting, at the very first meeting that President Obama had with his cabinet, one of the first things he said was about cooperation and partnerships. He said, our challenges are too big and our resources are too limited for us to be able to afford non-cooperation. I need all of you to cooperate with each other, and I need all of you to build partnerships with the private sector, with the philanthropic sector, across the branches of government. We need to work together. He's famous for saying about some of these challenges, we need all hands on deck. And he also said, and we need everybody holding hands while they're all on deck if we're going to get these problems solved. So let me talk a little more about some of these propositions, the centrality of science and technology, what do we need? And I'm not going to read these to you, I'll just go through the list. You can read faster than I can talk. A set of things in the way of the kinds of innovation we need for the economy. A set of things that we need for this health challenge. How do we get better outcomes for all Americans at lower cost? We get it not only with better health technology per se, but better use of information technology. It will be enormously important there. Energy, a whole set of things we need. Perhaps starting with better batteries and cheaper photovoltaic cells, but it's a much longer list. And again, in all these cases, there's a dot, dot, dot there. You can have your own ingredients to these lists. Agriculture. A lot of things that we need in agriculture. We have been, I think, relatively speaking, neglecting agricultural research in relation to its relative importance in the scale of challenges that we need to work with in this country and around the world going forward. And climate change, of course, an enormous set of challenges where science and technology and innovation have enormous contributions to make. National and homeland security as well, I've already suggested some of the things we need there. And again, I think all of you could make an even longer list. But it is clear when you contemplate this at this time that we need an enormous and diverse set of contributions from science and technology if we are to meet this array of challenges. Let me turn to the cross-cutting foundations of strength in science and technology. I start with the institutions that do most of the basic research in this country. Our great research universities, our national laboratories, nonprofit research centers, enormously important. We have to nurture them, we have to nourish them, we have to support them because they are crucial across all of the domains of specific applied challenges that we face. They're part of our infrastructure, but there are other key parts of our infrastructure for science and technology. Information technology and broadband, high-speed computing, energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, space technology. A lot of people think about space as the great adventure, looking outward, understanding the universe, exploring. It is all of those things, but it's also a very important and crucial set of kinds of infrastructure, communications infrastructure, global positioning, Earth observation. It is part of our scientific infrastructure that we cannot afford to neglect. Science, technology, engineering, and math education, which increasingly is referred to as STEM education, not referring to stem cells, but to science, technology, engineering, and math. The president has often said that the single most important thing he thinks we need to do for the future of our country is to lift the level of our game in STEM education. I'll talk a little more about that by and by. And finally, the fourth set of cross-cutting foundations are the economic and policy conditions that are conducive to entrepreneurship, to innovation, and to forming successful partnerships. And those include intellectual property rights, access to financing, tax policies like the research and experimentation tax credit, export policy, immigration policy, which affects how much easy interchange and how much cooperation we can have in science and technology with other countries. Transparency and predictability in regulation, also obviously important. Let me turn then, having described the challenges in this way, to what this administration has done and is doing to meet the challenges and exploit the opportunities that we face. And I start with what the president did to put science in its rightful place, as he called for in his inaugural speech, and I start with the appointments he made. This president has appointed 5 Nobel laureates in science to presidentially appointed positions. That's never happened before in the history of the Republic, and I list the 5 here. He has appointed more than 25 other members, beyond those Nobel laureates, of the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, Institute of Medicine, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, to presidentially appointed positions, including the heads of the NIH, NOAA, USPS, the Food and Drug Administration, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, more than 25 altogether. There have never been that many members of our science and engineering and medicine academies in presidential positions. We have a CTO, a Chief Technology Officer, and a Chief Information Officer for the first time in history in the White House. And we have an engineer, by the way, running EPA. Lisa Jackson, as some of you may not know, is a chemical engineer by training. Science, technology, and innovation have never been as prominent in leadership positions in our federal government. Putting science in its rightful place in speeches and events. The president has highlighted science, technology, and innovation in an enormous number of speeches. He did it throughout the campaign, in his inaugural address, in his State of the Union addresses, in the address I mentioned at the National Academy of Sciences, in a whole variety of speeches. I could fill pages with the number of speeches in which the president has stressed and emphasized the key importance of science, technology, and innovation in addressing the challenges our society faces. White House events. The number of times the president uses the podium and the platform and the venue of the Oval Office to highlight science and technology by bringing into the Oval Office national middle school and high school science and math winners, National Medal of Science and National Medals of Technology and Innovation winners, groups of U.S. astronauts. This is actually out of date. It's now 9 occasions. I apologize for not updating the slide. An earlier version snuck into this presentation. U.S. Nobel Prize winners, math and science teaching and mentoring award winners. The president has math and science teaching awards, mentoring awards in math and science, presidential early career awards in science and engineering, that is the PCAST. Prior presidents often didn't meet with those folks, or if they did, they just rushed in for a photo opportunity and rushed out again. I've never seen this president do that. His scheduler will say, this is just a photo op. And then the president will come into the room and he'll start chatting up the group and they'll talk to him and he'll stay there for 15 or 20 minutes, driving his scheduler nuts. But it reflects the president's genuine personal interest and engagement with science, technology, STEM education, the importance of what these young, mid-career, and older scientists, technologists, and innovators are achieving and how important it is. And he tells them that. No president has ever talked as much about science, technology, and innovation as this president has. A picture of him with middle school mathletes. These are middle school winners of a national mathematics competition in the Oval Office, just illustrative of it. I sometimes note that I think we in OSTP have probably the best batting average in the White House in terms of the fraction of events we propose that the president accepts. And the reason is we propose all these events that bring particularly young scientists and engineers and mathematicians into the White House. The president always says yes to that because he loves it. He said to me after one of these events, I wish I could spend more time with scientists and science students and less time with sports teams. He does like sports, but he likes science more. Bill already mentioned in introducing the extraordinary level of activity of this President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, his PCAST. I just list here the number of PCAST studies already requested by the President and completed. And again, you can read this faster than I can read it aloud. So just take a look at not just the number, but the breadth of the studies that this President has requested from his PCAST. PCAST is co-chaired by me and by Eric Lander, who is the distinguished mathematician and genomicist, who is the director of the MIT Harvard Broad Institute on Genomics. We have two vice chairs, Maxine Savitz, who's the vice president of the National Academy of Engineering, Bill Press, former deputy director of Los Alamos, former Harvard professor, now professor at Texas in 3 or 4 different disciplines, and 16 other members that come from industry, from NGOs, from academia, amazingly diverse and capable group, and the President is calling on that group all the time to do studies. These are studies underway with PCAST as we speak, and that's not all. Again, this slide is slightly outdated. In fact, Bill Bongellian mentioned one about the health of the research universities, which I didn't even get onto this slide in my haste. As I was going to mention earlier, in relation to that haste, after I said that I'd kind of aspired someday maybe be the science advisor to the President of the United States, that as I was testifying for 3 hours today before the House Appropriations Subcommittee that controls my budget and much of the rest of the science and technology budget, as it was going into the 3rd hour, I was thinking, you really have to be careful what you wish for. But we are doing a lot. This is the President meeting with his PCAST in one of the rooms of the East Wing of the White House, 3 Nobel laureates in the picture. Harold Varmus sitting across from the President expostulating at the moment. And I'm not falling asleep, I'm looking at my notes. You must know. These, in terms of science in its rightful place, are recommendations of PCAST studies that have already been implemented. That is, we're not just getting studies that the President asks for to him. He is paying attention and he is directing that the recommendations be implemented. The recommendation to prepare 100,000 new highly qualified K through 12 STEM teachers by the end of the decade. Launching a new advanced research projects agency for education. We already having launched one for energy, ARPA-E, this is ARPA-Ed. Initiating improvements to influenza vaccine manufacturing to shorten the production time frame. Expanding the ARPA-E domain and adding new energy innovation hubs which link national laboratories, universities, and corporations to get discovery from the laboratory into the marketplace. Accelerating the adoption of electronic health records. Supporting research to foster the next revolution in information technology. These are all recommendations by PCAST studies that the President has taken. I like this particular picture. The President not only listens to what PCAST says and reads what it writes, but he enjoys it, as you can see here. And that's the Nobel laureate in chemistry, Mario Molina, who's visible there right behind him, and Shirley Ann Jackson, another PCAST member, former director of, former chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in theoretical physics, I think in this country, but also from MIT, member of PCAST. Of course, in the end, people say if you want to know what's really happening, follow the money. I'll say a few words, therefore, about budgets. Those were also mentioned very kindly by Bill Bongellian. I thank you for that as well, Bill. Investments. Science got a huge boost, as Bill did mention, in the stimulus and recovery package. The FY 2009 and 10 budgets and the recovery package together added up to the highest federal research spending ever and the biggest boost, as he points out, in research spending since the space race. The Total Recovery Act funds for science and technology, including not just R&D, but information technology and transportation, infrastructure, applied energy technology, space exploration, over $100 billion in the recovery for science and technology. And the president, in that speech at the Academy that I've already mentioned in the spring of 2009, announced some new investment goals. He announced the goal of doubling the budgets of the basic science agencies, the most important basic science agencies, NSF, DOE, Office of Science, and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology Laboratories, double the budgets of those entities in the space of 10 years. He proposed to make the research and experimentation tax credit permanent to encourage more research and development in the private sector. And he proposed that we should aim to lift the sum of public and private investment in research and development to greater than or equal to 3% of GDP. It's never been there. At the height of the space race, we made it to 2.9% of the, of course, much smaller GDP at the time. Today it's about 2.8%. We want to get to 3 and beyond in spite of the budget constraints, the fiscal constraints that we face in today's economic environment. Bill also mentioned that we did better than most in the 2011 Appropriations Act that was passed only in the middle of last month. And this shows the 2010 appropriated levels for a number of the major science agencies, and then the 2011 budget that was just finally passed after a continuing resolution, which left us at the 2010 levels and left us with some of the constraints that the appropriations language in 2010 had applied. And again, this is not great news. This is not where we wanted to be. The budgets that the president proposed for 2011 were significantly higher than this in virtually every category. But compared to, again, as Bill said, the draconian cuts in many of the other categories, we did pretty well in science in this 2011 budget. And the president has proposed for 2012 a continuation of robust increases. This is what I was testifying about today before the relevant congressional committee. We want the Congress to work with us to observe the president's priorities. We're going to have to cut a lot of stuff. We're going to have to do a lot to try harder to balance the budget, to reduce the deficit. But the president has said repeatedly, I don't want to cut innovation. I don't want to cut education. I don't want to cut infrastructure. And these budget recommendations that he put forward in the 2012 budget in February reflect very substantial increases in most of the science categories. This is the picture provided to me by Kei Koizumi. He used to do this for the AAAS. His successor now does it for the AAAS, but he gets the numbers from Kei. Kei denies it. Anyway, it's a very instructive picture. It shows in constant FY 2011 dollars the picture from 1995 to 2012. We had increases through here that resulted in part from the studies that we did in the Clinton administration PCAST, recommending ramping up of research and development in the second term. That ramp up continued into the early part of the Bush administration, then it leveled off, came back down, then he had a big boost in the Recovery Act there, you see, in 2009. 2011, we didn't even quite hold the line, but we didn't go down as much as many other things did, and then this is the 2012 proposal trying to restore that upward trajectory. Bill also mentioned, he gave half my speech, actually. He just did it more briefly than I'm doing it. He mentioned that we have an American innovation strategy that has a number of ingredients, investing in the building blocks of innovation, most of which I've already mentioned. Promoting market-based innovation, again, I've mentioned most of the elements of that already, so I won't go through it. The strategy also includes catalyzing breakthroughs for national priorities where basically public goods are involved, and you can't expect the private sector to do all that is required. And that includes clean energy, accelerating biotech, nanotech, and advanced manufacturing to improve our competitive position to create sustainable, high-quality jobs, develop advances in space applications, breakthroughs in healthcare technology, and a leap forward in educational technologies. And finally, again, some cross-cutting issues. All of these efforts include increased support for early career scientists and engineers, increased support for commercializing university research, increased support for multidisciplinary and high-risk, high-return research, and increased support for partnerships across sectors. I'm probably doing terribly on time here. I better get going. Working with the private sector, what most people don't realize is that firms today are funding 2/3 of U.S. research and development and performing more than 70% of it. So we can't just do this job in the federal government. We have to work with and encourage the private sector, making the research and experimentation tax credit permanent is part of that. Recovery Act has helped start and grow clean energy businesses across the country. Small Business Innovation Research Initiative is providing lots of funding for many different avenues of innovation. The Small Business Lending Bill signed last September increases loans and cuts tax rates for entrepreneurs. And of course, I've mentioned the DOE's Energy Innovation Hubs already. This is the President visiting GE in Schenectady in January of this year, looking into a big turbine. We launched just at the end of January a new initiative called Startup America to bolster entrepreneurship, having successful entrepreneurs mentor aspiring entrepreneurs and get a higher success rate in high-growth startup. Let me move right along. NASA and human spaceflight. We inherited a space program that was in disarray after years of mismatch between the vision and the budget that were supplied. The Augustine Committee, which we stood up to look at the human space exploration program, the Constellation program, deemed that program for crewed missions beyond low Earth orbit to be unexecutable. That meant no matter how much money we pour at it now, we cannot meet the original goals of the program. It was over budget, behind schedule, underperforming. We had to fix it. And meanwhile, in NASA, Earth science, space science, and aeronautics had all been gutted to feed the Constellation program to try to narrow that gap. There wasn't enough money to narrow the gap, but it was enough to harm all these other programs. The International Space Station was going to be scrapped in 2016 after putting $100 billion in it. It was going to be flown into the Indian Ocean in order to save money to pay for a rocket whose principal purpose was to carry astronauts to the International Space Station. It was one of the aspects in which the program was dysfunctional. And the projected gap in our ability to transport U.S. astronauts to low Earth orbit on U.S. rockets after the retirement of the space shuttle was in fact lengthening. We developed with great effort a plan to reduce the discrepancies, to reduce the gaps, to rebalance NASA's programs with longer use of the International Space Station to 2020 or longer, more science in the program, more R&D on advanced systems, more diverse destinations for crewed missions, and increased reliance on commercial transport of crew to low Earth orbit to free up NASA to focus its advanced and unique resources on the more demanding missions beyond low Earth orbit. We rolled that plan out with the President's 2011 budget. He elaborated it in a speech just a little over a year ago at the Kennedy Space Center. And this is the President on that visit to the Kennedy Space Center visiting one of the private efforts. SpaceX Falcon 9 was subsequently launched successfully. And in fact, I'll say a word about that in a minute. The NASA Authorization Act of 2010 was a compromise. It had much that the President and NASA wanted, but it also reflected the congressional desire to use existing technologies and contracts to develop a new heavy lift rocket by the end of 2016. It's going to be very challenging to do that. Sometimes the Congress believes that they put something in legislation, it will definitely happen. That is not necessarily true. You can't legislate necessarily the laws of physics or some of the ironclad laws of engineering development. But in any case, that's the goal, and we're going to try to meet it. The President's 2012 budget funds all of the elements of that act. The omens for commercial crew are improving. Two recent successful launches of the SpaceX Falcon 9. And one of the Constellation Prime contractors is now in the competition for commercial crew. That's a good thing. Energy and environment, lots of initiatives. I just put them up here and let you speed read this list of things the administration has done in the energy and environment domain. It's really extraordinary. In 2012, we've got $550 million for ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. Energy efficiency and renewable energy is up 43% in the 2012 budget from the 2010 appropriation. We want to double the number of energy hubs, mentioned that already. We're making climate change mitigation and adaptation a priority for initiatives in departments and agencies employing their existing authorities. We didn't get the bill we wanted through Congress last year to do this through congressional action, but we're going to do what we can with existing authorities. And in the meanwhile, we're going to work with the Congress on initiatives to accelerate the transition to cleaner and more efficient energy options that bring multiple benefits. You don't have to make the argument for new energy technologies just on the basis of climate change. It brings economic benefits, other environmental benefits, and security benefits. And of course, we're going to continue to work with other major emitting countries to build technology cooperation and individual and joint climate policies that make sense. National Oceans Policy, again, I'm not going to read this to you, but in July 2010, we had a new National Oceans Policy setting up a National Oceans Council to run an interagency effort with all kinds of new priorities and goals. This is the President signing the bill, flanked by me and Nancy Sutley, the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, with whom I co-chair the National Oceans Council. STEM education, enormous set of initiatives in STEM education, including initiatives based on partnerships. We have in the Educate to Innovate program $700 million and more of private sector and philanthropic support for improving K through 12 education, in large part by bringing role models, mentors, and helpers from the national labs, the universities, and corporations, scientists, mathematicians, and engineers into the classroom to work with the teachers on improving curriculum, improving the hands-on activities available to the kids, and serving as living examples of what exciting careers are available in this domain. This was president of the White House Science Fair in October of last year. A bunch of initiatives and principles and procedures. I just list some of them here. Stem cell guidelines, streamlined reporting procedures for federal grants, scientific integrity principles, open government, new databases available in every agency in the open government, and more partnerships in the international domain. We've been reviving and strengthening our high-level Joint Commission meetings on science and technology cooperation with the 6 countries where we have those ministerial level agreements, nurturing the strong cooperation that has long existed with the EU, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, Multilateral Economic Forum, U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, U.S.-Russia Presidential Commission, all have very strong science, technology, and innovation focuses. We've been streamlining the visa procedures and applying to visiting scientists and technologists. Science, technology, and innovation are the centerpiece of the new USAID development strategy, and of course the Cairo speech in June of 2009, developing the concept of science envoys and centers of excellence around the world. We've got 2 sets now of science envoys going to different countries across the developing world. You see them pictured here in the countries they visited. It's been a remarkably successful and welcome effort around the world. We've had reviews in which we gathered the science envoys to talk about what they've learned. A lot has come out of that. We're sponsoring a conference on it this spring to figure out better how to move forward. There are lots more challenges ahead. How do we sustain support for science and technology under the budget cuts? Some of the particularly demanding issues, things that will be challenging to sustain in this budget environment are listed here. Virtually in every agency, there are things that are going to be targeted for one reason or another. Either they're big and expensive, or in the case of the last category, many members of Congress don't like international cooperation. They don't understand why it makes sense, so that's always a target. Challenges, of course, in getting the key messages across. I've mentioned that already. The challenge of advancing a coherent climate policy, energy and climate integrated. The challenge of implementing public interest information technology initiatives, health IT, government efficiency and openness, public safety, and of course, the systemic weaknesses in STEM education, which we have to remedy if we are to move this country smartly into the rest of this century. The linchpin of progress in these domains really is a knowledgeable and committed president, and we fortunately have one. Thank you very much.